and we're continuing the story from last week about the exile, about the Egyptian slavery, and leading into next week when the Jews go free. But really, the process of freedom starts this week. And we're going to give an overview and then launch into today's class. So, Parshas Ve'era on this Chumash we have here is on page 350 and 351. So, it follows directly from last week's Parsha, where Moses is sent to Egypt to save the Jewish people. He gets to Egypt and he goes to Pharaoh, all confident with God's mission. He says, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "Who's God? I don't know what you're talking about." The Jewish people get excited for a moment, but then Pharaoh makes life more difficult, harder for them. They have to do more work and more difficult work, and they give up hope. And Moses comes back to God at the end of last week's part and says, what did you send me for? You only made life more miserable for the Jews. And in this week's opening, God tells him, basically, I'm a little disappointed. All your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I promised things to them. They never questioned me. Even when things didn't always seem to go exactly as they thought, the promises weren't fulfilled yet. They had faith. And you're asking me questions. Trust this process, basically. And he tells Moses, go again. And Moses says, the Jews won't listen to me. Pharaoh won't listen to me. God says, I'm giving you signs to prove yourself to Pharaoh. Go. Trust me, go, and you will be successful. Take the Jews out of Egypt. Then the Parsha gives a little bit of background to who Moses and Aaron was, history, and then goes back to the story on page 354. And we go back to Moses and Aaron, and they enter Pharaoh into his palace. And they do the miracles to prove God to Pharaoh, but also what we call the plagues. They tell Pharaoh, if you don't let the Jewish people go, we are going to smite you with a series of plagues. And so after Moses does his original tricks, where his staff turns into a serpent, then he says, God tells him, go meet Pharaoh at the Nile and tell him if he refuses to allow the Jewish people to go, the water will turn to blood. And of course, we know what happened. The water turns to blood, and Pharaoh is obviously not amused, but also not moved enough to let the Jewish people go. And so comes plague number 2. And Moses tells Pharaoh, if you don't let us go, there will be frogs everywhere around Egypt. And lo and behold, frogs suddenly appeared to jump everywhere in Egypt. We have in this week's Parsha 7 of the 10 plagues. So after the frogs, you can follow along in here, the frogs page 360 and 361, and Pharaoh refuses to let Jewish people go. And then it comes the lice. And the dust of the earth turns to lice, and everyone is scratching their hair, itchy, and Pharaoh again refuses. And now we have plague number 4 on page 364, and all the wild animals. Again, Pharaoh refuses. After initially saying, fine, I'll let you go. Just get rid of this plague. But once the plague goes away, he moves the goalpost and says, actually, I don't want you to go. Plague number 5 comes along, which is all the animals very sick. And the same story repeats itself. Pharaoh begs Moses, get rid of this, I'll let you go. But as soon as it's no longer threatening him, he says, actually, I do not want to let the Jewish people go at all. There's no deal. The deal is off. He breaks his ceasefire. And then the 7th plague in this week's Parsha is a plague of hail, where all rains down. So the 6th plague is the skin disease. Everyone has this boils in their skin. And the 7th plague is hail, where it rains down fire and ice from the heavens, destroys all the crops, kills all the animals that were outside, and wreaks havoc on Egypt. But the end of the Parsha, again, Pharaoh refuses to let the Jewish people go. And we lead into next week's Parsha, the last 3 of the 10 plagues. This is a story we're all very familiar with. from Passover. We sit at the Seder, and if you have kids, you probably have those little puppets, or we're talking about the story of the plagues. Everyone knows the 10 plagues. What I want to discuss this evening is, what was the purpose of these 10 plagues? Why did God bring them on the Egyptians? Why did he afflict the Egyptians with these 10 plagues? Any suggestions?
My response is to show his power.
Show his power, okay?
I guess just to show his presence in general, like there is a higher power.
Just to prove it is there. Okay? Would one plague be enough for that?
Obviously not.
Obviously not, right?
Going. I mean, Pharaoh was unimpressed by the first few plagues, right?
Pharaoh was unimpressed by the first few plagues. The truth is, there were some plagues that Pharaoh was impressed with. God told Moses, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Now, what does that mean? That means on his own, Pharaoh would have been moved by the plagues, and God almost forced him, hardened his heart, forced him to say, I don't care. But Pharaoh actually was impressed, if not for God's intervention.
He was impressed, but then he always like basically had his own people be like, okay, well, you can do the same. Like, for example, the water turned into blood. Then he had his people that kind of did the same, right? To replicate that, just to show,
Right.
Oh, if your God can do that, I can do the same kind of thing.
Yes, the first one we find that. The rest of them don't find that. But yes, no. The question is though, God told Moses originally, you're gonna go to Pharaoh, you're gonna perform these miracles, and I'm gonna make sure he doesn't get impressed. I'm gonna harden his heart. Almost seems without God's intervention, Pharaoh would have been impressed. At least at some point along the line, before we get to 10. After 3, 4, but God, for whatever reason, didn't want Pharaoh to be impressed. He wanted to bring the whole series of plagues. I don't want to finish this prematurely, right? I don't want to say, oh, go, and we only got to the plague from number 4. God wanted to finish the whole series.
Maybe he wanted the Egyptians to kind of feel like they can no longer rely on Pharaoh to protect them.
Okay.
Something like that, along those lines.
Maybe it was weakening the Egyptians' trust in Pharaoh.
Yeah.
All right.
Maybe to have them get to a point of desperation.
Okay, desperation. You wanted to really hit him hard. So we're discussing, Jordan, why God would bring these 10 plagues on the Egyptians. What was the purpose?
I figured that's what we'd be talking about.
All right, so you got it right. So suggestions have been so far to show his presence, prove himself as he exists, to create desperation, and to weaken the trust in Pharaoh and the Egyptian populace.
I mean, it would seem like the goal is really, of this whole story is really shaping of the Jewish people into a people with a relationship with God. And so it would seem to me more about them and their experiences as witnesses and participants in this than anything else. So yeah, there's the obvious thing of certain just the power and like, okay, this God is a more powerful God than any person, any pharaoh, any his diviners, because he's got his own like diviners, right? They're like whatever. They're able to work some magic too. They're interesting that they create serpents that then God's serpent eats.
Right.
So, but like, if the goal is, I think it's. I don't know what the other than just raw demonstration of power and supremacy. I strikes me that there might be something deeper, but I'm not sure what it would be.
Okay. So yes, there's something deeper going on.
I have another angle to impress Jews, to strengthen their faith in God, and also to increase the stakes of this epic battle. Bring it on the highest level possible.
Okay. Yeah, all good suggestions. And the truth is, there's not a strong indication in the text itself, or actually, there's multiple indications in the text itself, which leads the commentaries to have different angles and perspectives. And I think overall there are three angles, three ways of, and we almost covered them all here. I'm just going to go through them and where we see in the text itself maybe a proof or support for them. So the first and most obvious that everyone thinks of before you come in here, this class is already very sophisticated, but most people on the street, to punish Pharaoh or to allow the Jews to go, right? It was just to get them out of there. And there is some support for that. In the first time we hear about this, going back hundreds of years, Abraham, when he had the covenant with God, the Bris Ben Habsarim, the covenant of parts, when God told him, your children are going to be slaves in a foreign land, and they will leave with a lot of wealth. So he foretells Abraham the exodus from Egypt. He says, there will be slaves, and I will hold those that oppress them accountable. I will judge them. I will punish them. So it seems from there, a very simplistic reading, God telling Abraham, your children will suffer, but I will make sure those that cause them to suffer will be punished. So the plagues come almost as a punishment in that understanding, right? We know for sure it's not just getting the Jews out of Egypt, because go straight for the big blow, death of the firstborns, right? Or get it done. If God wanted the Jews out of Egypt, he could have paralyzed all of Egypt. He could have done whatever. He could have changed Pharaoh's heart to want to go. But this way he wanted to punish them. Maimonides, Rambam, says his approach, God was punishing Pharaoh and the Egyptians for their cruelty to the Jews. Now, he wanted to really punish them well, and so he didn't even allow Pharaoh to have remorse. He hardened his heart. He's like, you deserve more than this. I'm going to make sure you get punished more, because the depravity and the cruelty that he showed over centuries, the Jewish people needed a punishment that was going to really tit for tat, really get him or get all the Egyptians for what they inflicted on the Jewish people.
Are there stories in the Midrash about this?
Well, these are the stories of the plagues. The Egyptians suffered with the plagues. The Midrash does say how each plague is a direct consequence or punishment for something specific the Egyptians did or Pharaoh did. I don't remember all of them offhand, but for example, it says Pharaoh would bathe in the blood of Jewish children for healing, and therefore the water turned to blood. The Nile River, which was sustenance of the Egyptians, grew their crop, drinking water, turned to blood as a punishment for him sort of using the Jewish blood cheaply. So the Midrash does explain how each one of the plagues is a specific retribution for something the Egyptians did. So that's the first reading. It's a punishment. The Egyptians deserve this punishment. The second reading, which fits with what many of you said here, is that he wanted to show his power and might, his presence to the Egyptians. And that's supported many times in the text of the Parsha this week. I'll give you a couple of examples. When God tells Moshe to bring the plagues to Pharaoh, originally, page 356. So God is saying, Pharaoh won't listen to you, and I'll be able to do more plagues. So in verse 4, so we're in chapter 7, verse 4. Pharaoh will not listen to you. I will then lay my hand upon Egypt and bring forth my host, my people, the Israelites, from Egypt by bringing great plagues. The Egyptians too will recognize that I am God, and I raise my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from the midst. So the plagues, the Egyptians will realize that I am God. And this expression repeats itself throughout. God says the plagues, so the Egyptians should know that I'm God. So that's sort of the second angle, that the plagues were meant to impress the Egyptians with sort of faith in God. It doesn't still account for why the need for 10 plagues, and these 10 plagues specifically. But there's something that God wanted to impress upon them, his power, his presence. And the third angle is what also a couple you mentioned, for the Jewish people. The Jews were the people of Abraham, right? They're his grandkids. They had this monotheistic faith in their family tradition, but they had been slaves sunken into the worst of Egypt for centuries, right? They had lost a lot of their own culture, a lot of their own ideas. They were slaves, they don't have their own identity. And they were just part of the culture of Egypt. So they were so sunken in to the thinking of the surrounding Egyptian culture and belief system to impress upon them the faith of Abraham, the monotheism, belief in God, which is going to become the foundation of their future peoplehood, of the nation, of the Jewish people. They go to Sinai, receive the Torah, and become the Jews. They had to have a proper understanding and reckoning of who this God was that they were going to worship. I mean, think about it. The Jews had all but lost hope in being saved. Moses comes to them and God's going to free you. They didn't listen to him because they were so depressed or so stressed. So now you tell me, who's this God? God? He's abandoned us for 100 years. Can you really do this? Can God really free us from Egypt? Is that a real power? And so for the Jewish people to really understand God and not just allow them to leave Egypt as believing Jews. So they can take the Jews out of Egypt, but the plagues were meant to take the Egypt out of the Jews. So this is very similar to the second idea, to impress faith in God. The question is, who was the target audience? Was it the Egyptian people? Which is kind of hard to square because the Egyptian people were lost to history, right? They're gone. They're drowning most of them drowned in the sea. Pharaoh wasn't going to survive this. So what would be the point of this massive spectacle for people that are going to be lost to history? But it kind of fits better to say the Jewish people. This is all for them. Now, it was an incredible show of God's might. This whole story was over the span of a year. Right? We read in the Parsha, it's one Parsha. Plague, 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 plague. This is spread out over a year. Right? And think about how long a year is, right? I was thinking this week, the context of the war in Israel. It feels like forever, right? And like, how long does it take? And just reach a victory or a deal, and things get dragged out, and it feels like forever. The Jewish people have Moses coming to save them, and instead of like, okay, we're gone, it's a whole year, 12 months or 10 months or 12 months process until they can actually go free. They may not have been working very hard at this point during the plagues, but they were still captive in Egypt. They couldn't leave. And so this drawn-out process would have been very stressful for the Jewish people. Just get us out of here already. But there was something very important God needed to impress upon them and show them it was worth dragging this out. Rita, you have your hand up there? You're on mute. You're on mute, I can't hear.
Okay, I think it's better now. Was there any distinction made between the cruelty of the Pharaoh and the response of the Egyptians? Are they considered the same, of the same ilk, or there was some kind of differential made?
Good question. So there is definitely the element of collective punishment in the plagues. And I'll get to that in a second, how widespread that was, that possibly the Jews were also caught up in the collective punishment. So whether or not the Egyptians were as guilty as Pharaoh and therefore deserving of it, or just collateral damage, isn't clear. We do assume that the Egyptians as a whole were responsible. They all made the Jews' life miserable. And so they did bear collective responsibility. I think that's the primary understanding, but it's not 100% clear in the Torah text itself.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to share something very interesting, and it's a very, I think, a larger conversation to get into the analysis, but I'm gonna try my best to give part of it here, because I think it's a fascinating approach and a real textual analysis that gives an understanding and context of the plagues. If you look at the 10 plagues, there are 7 in this week's Parsha and 3 in next week's. There are many patterns that emerge in the plagues. And these patterns are clues to what really God was trying to achieve. There was a system to these 10 plagues. I'll point out a few of these patterns and see what they mean. As a whole, the plagues 10 was divided into 3, 3, 3, and then the last plague was the death of the firstborn, like the last nail in the coffin. But before that, which was securing the freedom, right? The last plague was to secure freedom of the Jewish people. The first 9 were not. We just established that. The first 9 were to impress something on the Egyptians and the Jews. There are 3 sets of 3 plagues here. And the way we know this is through the way the Torah describes these plagues. And I'll give you a few of the indications of these patterns, okay? The first one is like this. The warning for the plague. Okay? Plague number 1. Let's look at it inside. We'll do this quickly because there's a lot to say over here. So plague number 1 on page 357, verse 15. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, right? It says, tells him when to go to Pharaoh in the morning. Then over on page 359, it says, through this you will recognize that I am God. I'm going to strike the water of the river with my staff, and it will turn into blood. So he warns him in the morning about a plague that's coming in the future, right? Let's go to plague number 2. And here we have a warning in verse 26, the bottom of 359. Go to Pharaoh, come to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what God said, 7 people may serve me. If you refuse to let them leave, I will plague all your territory with frogs. So there's a warning here, but we're not told what time he warned him. So the first plague, in the morning he warned him. Second plague is a warning. The third plague, on page 363, there's no warning. We're told that Aaron took the dirt, threw it up, and became to lice. Pharaoh never got a warning for plague number 3. So we have warn him exactly when to warn him, the morning, just warn him, and then no warning at all. Now that pattern repeats itself again. Plague number 4, God says to Moses, verse 16 and 363, rise early in the morning to meet Pharaoh and tell him, if you don't send the Jews out, there's going to be a plague of wild animals. Okay, so warn him in the morning. Plague number 5, 365, chapter 9. God tells Moses, come to Pharaoh and tell him, God says, if you don't let the Jewish people go, there'll be a plague. A warning without a time. And then plague number 6, verse 8, there's no warning. God tells Moses and Aaron, do this plague. Pharaoh never gets warned. Okay? And that repeats itself again. Plague number 7, 367, verse 13. God says to Moses, rise early in the morning and warn Pharaoh. And then next week's Parsha, plague number 8, warn Pharaoh. Plague number 9, there's no warning for it at all. Okay? So we have our pattern. It's repeating itself. Sets of 3, right? So there's already indication that there's something happening here that's dividing these into sets of 3, and the 3 is a sort of an evolution within each set. I'll point 1 or 2 more things out before I just we'll discuss what this means. We look closely at what the purpose, God says the purpose of the plague that Egyptians should know that I exist, right? The wording of this is said 3 times at plague number 1, plague number 4, and plague number 7. Each one is slightly different. Okay? So let's look at this. This is going to be a clue into what these three sets were trying to achieve. Plague number one. Was before all the plagues, right? When God tells Moses, we read this before, that they're going to take the Jews. Where is this? Yeah, on 357. The Egyptians too recognize that I am God. I raise my hand over Egypt. Before the first plague, we're told the point is the Egyptians should recognize that I am God. End of sentence. End of story. If you look at plague number 4, where there's also a similar sentiment, beginning of the second set of plagues, and this is on page 363. On verse 18, tells them there's going to be all these animals, wild animals, and he says, "In that day I will set apart Goshen, my people dwell. Thus you will realize that I am God in the midst of the land." So here he adds in the words, "I am God within the land." Not just know that I am God, know that I am God within the land. And then plague number 7, on verse 14, page 367. For this time I'm about to send a plague that's all more than other plagues against your very heart, against your courtiers and your people, so that you will realize there is none like me in all the world. So a little different this time. Not only is there a God that's within the earth, within the world, but also there's none like me within, no other gods like God. Nothing similar. No other gods are remotely close. Okay? So the commentaries share something very interesting. That the 3 sets of plagues were meant to achieve 3 shifts in the consciousness of the Egyptians and the Jewish people. The first shift, that there is a God. The second shift, that God actually is within the world. And the third is that God is the ultimate power. The only power, or the most sort of different to any other God or power we have in this world. And that was the 3 sets of plagues. Because if you think about it, we say we believe in God, faith. But what is faith? Faith has to be broken down into a bunch of principles. When someone says, "I believe in God," God's a 3-letter word. You don't believe in words. It's a concept, right? So what are you believing in? Most people of faith, believers, have a hard time articulating what it is they believe in. I believe in God. A power, unless you study philosophy and have a really developed sense, to describe what you believe in is difficult, right? Because you don't give it enough attention. I believe, right? That's it. But even if a person can't articulate it, if they're forced to, and you think about it, there's going to be specific details you believe in. Otherwise, not a belief. If it's nothing I believe in, then there's no belief in God. So a belief in God has to be meaningful, has to mean something. And these 3 principles, there's many ways to divide it, but it's very simple dividing what our faith in God is. A, there is a God. There is a being beyond that world. That's the elemental principle. That's the baseline. Now, what is that? Is it something out there, a God which is removed? No, that God also is present in this world. That's a huge idea as well, of Jewish faith particularly. It's not sort of, there is a God who created a world, but now we're on our own. No, God is very much present, has expectations from this world, responds to the world. So it's very much a relationship we have with him in our world. He can intervene in the world. He's affected, quote unquote, by how we behave in this world. So there's a very interrelationship between God and the world, and the universe. And the third, most profound, I guess, element of faith is that God is the ultimate being. That nothing in our world, whether the pagan worship gods or even our own gods we create that we're looking for in our life, of recognition, of fame, of money, of pleasure, all these things pale in comparison. Nothing can really shine a torch to God. God is the most powerful being there is. And these are sort of three stages of faith that God wanted to inculcate into the Egyptians, but more importantly, into the Jewish people before they exited Egypt and became the Jewish nation.
But how do they correlate specifically to the facts of
These plagues? Right. So how do these three connect with these three sets of plagues? I don't know, watch me, so I'm just gonna go over time. Let me know, because this is something which there's so many details here, and even in these series of plagues, there's a lot of patterns that once you start realizing it, you begin to notice. So it's a lot to say. On a whole, it's interesting to point out the first three plagues are all manipulating things from the earth and the water. The water turns to blood, frogs come out of the river, the dirt turns to lice. The next three plagues are dealing with the above land. So we have the wild animals, we have the animals dying, boils of people's skin, right? Well, that's already number 7. The next three are dealing with things in the heavens or the sky or the air. Hail raining down, locusts are blown in by the wind, and darkness descends over the world. So there's already an indication where we're moving up between sort of very earthly things that are more life forms, and then things beyond us, the universe outside of our own area of control. And so we see they're moving up in what degree of control God has. So what areas of the universe God has control over. That's one point. Another interesting thing I'll just point out, I think it's fascinating, before we get into how these plagues match the particulars. Within each set of plagues, and if I'm saying too much information, I'm sorry, but I just find this so interesting when you get to the specifics. Within each three set, so we pointed out before one pattern. God, he warned him in the morning, just warned him, no warning at all. There's also about when the plague is going to happen, giving him a specific time or more specific time, exact time when it's going to happen. So within each plague as well, there's a preciseness that gets added as within each set. And if you think about it also, it gets more personal to the human being. And so, for example, blood is the water. It begins with the environment being affected. Then frogs, so animal life is affected. Then the human being, lice, which actually makes itchy the human being. Then we have again the environment, wild animals. Then you have their own animals dying. And then the human beings getting the boils. Then we have hail, which is the environment. We have locusts, which is coming in and affecting their crops, and also it's more personal. Then darkness, which entrenches into every person who couldn't move. Human beings were affected. So again, we have this pattern emerging, but whatever was trying to be achieved went through these stages of how deep it's affecting them. And then the next set of plagues, achieving the next objective, also went through its stages of affecting them. So you have all these patterns sort of on top of themselves and within each set. Now, what are these three things? And how they fit the plagues? I don't think this is a stretch. It's not, obviously you can spin things anyway, but my understanding is like this. And I think it's also important for us because the Ramban, Nachmanides, one of the commentaries, medieval commentaries, is very interesting. Because why do we keep mentioning the exodus from Egypt in everything we do in Judaism? You make Kiddush on Shabbat, you know what you say? I'm celebrating Shabbat Zeicher Yetziat Mitzrayim, to remember the exodus from Egypt. We read the Shema and we say, Sher Hotesicha Meret Mitzrayim, God took out of Egypt. Everything we're doing is mentioning Egypt. Why is it such a big theme? And Nachmanides says the following. He says, the faith of the Jewish people were inspired by, at that moment, the miracle they saw was sort of the proper, giving them the proper perspective of God. We don't have miracles in our lives, for the most part, that are slapping us in the face and saying, hey, God's here. That same impression they got, most of us don't experience in our lifetime. And we're trying almost to hang on to the inspiration they had, trying to recreate that moment in our own head. Remember our ancestors? They witnessed this. And so therefore, that's trying to give us that same faith which they had then. So God wasn't just telling the Jewish people 3,500 years ago who he was and developing that faith within them. It was for all of history, setting the tone. That moment, keep looking back to this moment. That's the faith of a Jew. So that's why we constantly relive that moment, look back to that moment of the exodus of Egypt. What are the, now going back to what you said, how do the plagues play out? What are the things? And I want to introduce this by one more question. And we mentioned before about collateral damage. Something very interesting, and there's debate in the commentaries. All the water turned to blood. The first plague. Did the Jews have water to drink? The water supply in Egypt, the Jews were citizens in Egypt.
The other one that says they were Goshen, it was okay, but this one I guess you're saying it didn't have that.
The first time we find a distinction is plague number 4.
They say Goshen, it was fine.
Plague 1, 2, and 3, there's no mention of distinction between the Jews and the Egyptians. Plague number 4, it says that animals won't go into Goshen. So some commentaries say, no, obviously the Jews had good drinking water. They did nothing wrong. Why would God bring a plague to the Jews? Right? It's against what he's trying to achieve here of getting the Egyptians hurt to free the Jewish people, hurting the Jews. And so some commentaries, the Midrash says the Jews had drinking water. To the extent that Midrash says the Jews were able to monetize the plague by selling water to the Egyptians. And so it assumes for sure the Jews weren't affected, the frogs didn't go into their homes, into their areas, and the lice did not affect the Jewish people. Even though the Torah text doesn't explicitly say it, it's obvious.
Was Goshen on the river though? Because this is really about the river water.
The Nile was sort of the source of water for everywhere in Egypt, the irrigation for all the fields.
Well, it says though, but they were able to dig wells outside the river for water.
Yes.
So if Goshen, I don't know where do we know where Goshen was geographically? It wouldn't be surprising if it was away from the river because they didn't like the fact that they were shepherds and animals, livestock. You'd want to keep livestock away from the river. So in my head, I always kind of imagine, so it's not near the river.
I don't know. My geography isn't great. I don't know. I think we do know where it is, though. I think there's still a Goshen in Egypt, or we know where it is.
Right, New York.
Goshen, New York, right? Upstate. Good question. I don't know. It definitely could have been separated, a source of water, but these commentaries assume that it was. Other commentaries say no. The fact that plague number 4 Torah makes the effort to tell us there's a distinction means plagues 1, 2, and 3 there was no distinction, and the collateral damage affected the Jewish people too. They were hurt by these plagues. Fascinating. Think about it. The Jews suffered the first 3 plagues. Now, they weren't suffering those plagues wasn't bad. No one was hurt in the first 3 plagues, or injured, or died, but it was hard, right? So, in this perspective, something changed between the first 3 plagues and then onwards. The first 3 plagues, we said, were just about God's presence, that God exists, showing that he can manipulate nature. Not yet that God actually is a force within the world, understanding, relates to the world. So the force of, just as a force that exists, doesn't discriminate. It is, God is. God is a force behind the universe, he exists. And therefore, he just made it. I'm showing my presence here. You want to get into specifics, the Nile was worshipped in Egypt as a god, sort of deity because it was a source of water. So poisoning the Nile with blood is kind of showing God's supremacy. I exist, not your God, right? So it was directly targeting what they looked at as their deity.
Which goes with the serpent supremacy,
Yes.
which is the same, right? The same scene.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the next follows from that, yeah.
Right.
So the point was just to show God's presence. And then it goes deeper to the frogs, and then to the lice was the straw that broke the camel's back in this regard, where the Egyptian sorcerers weren't able to recreate and replicate that plague. And the third plague, they finally say, this is God's work. Magic can't do this, right? It says there's a finger of God after the third plague. This is on page 363. The necromancers said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. We can't replicate it, can't imitate it. So that sort of mission of proving that it's not just a magic trick, there's a force here beyond the world, God. Those three plagues were bringing it closer to home until it hit home. And it couldn't be replicated. And now, sort of that mission was accomplished. God exists. There's an inexplicable force that's beyond nature. Nothing within our world, within our system, can make this happen. And the blood, they could also make tricks to make it happen. It doesn't mean there's a force beyond the world. Pharaoh and the Egyptians had beliefs in gods. But when Moses comes to him and says, I have my God of the Hebrews, who's this God? Never heard of him. Why didn't we hear of him? He wasn't the same sort of class of gods as the other ones, one of the multiple. This was a different God altogether. It wasn't a sort of a force of nature, a force we can relate to. It's something outside of the system itself. The force behind all the forces. And that Pharaoh says, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't deal with that. But here it's being proven that all of their sort of gods, all the forces they could manipulate, being very advanced society for their age, they could not make this happen. It was proven beyond doubt to them, there's a God here. There's something at play which is beyond us. The fourth plague, fifth and sixth plague, was meant to intimate to people that God actually is very present in the world, is within the world. And that's what we find for the first time, whether or not it actually was the first time, the first time Torah emphasizes this, a distinction was made between the Egyptians and the Jews. Because here God was trying to prove himself, I know who's who. I'm very much within this world, responding to behavior of people in the world. I'm not an outside presence. God, I am also very much immanent within this world we live in. And therefore I can discriminate between the Egyptians who deserve this and the Jews who don't. And if you look at his language, that's exactly what the verse says. In verse 18, on page 363, I will set apart Goshen, where my people dwell, so that there will not be any mixed horde there. Thus you will realize that I am God in the midst of the land. Now, the distinction I'm making itself, that distinction is the purpose here. That I can make wild animals come here and not over here. That is what I'm trying to prove to you over here in this sort of act of God. Imagine like an act of God, a wildfire or a hurricane or an earthquake. Imagine there was certain sort of neighborhoods that literally weren't touched. Say, wow, the fact that there's a sort of act of God something beyond us, okay. But the fact that it can sort of harm this block, this house get affected, and this house not, that's like a whole different world. God I see now is actually picking and choosing. He's very much within this world, very much a presence that is responding to the world and has sort of expectation of the world. There's a relationship between human beings, the universe, and God. He's here, he's present. That repeats itself for the fifth plague as well, where the animals of the Jewish people are affected, and the sickness only affected the Egyptians, and the same too with the skin inflammation. So again, taken from the environment to the animals that they owned, to the human being itself, how the discrimination between the Egyptians and the Jews was cemented. And again, we find here mission accomplished. Plague number 6. Here, the advisors, the necromancers, or the diviners, whatever you want to call them, Not only couldn't they achieve this, they didn't even show up. So the sixth plague, on verse 11, page 367, the necromancers could not stand before Moses to challenge him because the inflammation had attacked the necromancy of all Egypt. So they were affected. Now, practically it's telling us they were affected by this boil so badly they couldn't show up to work. But why is it important here? The importance is not only couldn't they replicate God, they totally were sidelined. They're now out of the picture, meaning whatever belief they have has been negated entirely. The Torah is hinting to us something's been achieved here that the necromancers totally can't even show up. They're not present because something's been proven to them beyond doubt, and that is that God is present within this world. Yeah.
Question, and I don't know if I'm getting that right, but the first three plagues where the Jews also were pretty much affected by the plagues, was that a little bit more like a wake-up call? Because in the beginning the Jews didn't even want to like leave Egypt, right? They were like, no, we're here, that's it, like this is our destiny, like this is what's our life, this is what our life is, right? And then in the fourth plague and so on, where they realize, oh, God is actually sparing us from the plagues, and oh, maybe there is such a thing, and maybe we should understand that we are, meant to leave this place and now listen to God, what he's telling us to do.
Possibly, yeah. Possibly. So the Jews also needed kind of the plagues to wake them out of their wake up call. That maybe.
Hmm.
Maybe if it wouldn't have affected them, they would have still been stuck in that mentality.
Because they weren't listening to Moses, obviously, right? In the beginning.
Well, yes, the very beginning, last week's Parsha, they did. They got excited, and then it ended up badly for them. Pharaoh made it worse. And this time around, Moses came back to Egypt, and they were like, we had enough. It's not happening. So yes, maybe they also needed they needed to feel the pain, not just the joy. Sometimes pain can hit deeper than joy. Just feeling joy at the Egyptian suffering, maybe wouldn't have done it, and they needed to feel the pain themselves to really break them out of that posture. Possibly, yeah. So then we come to the third set. And the third set, the third set of plagues, which we only have the first one in this week's Parsha, and the next two come in the next week's Parsha of hail, is proving that there's sort of God is not just here, not just existing, not just present in our world, but the ultimate force of everything. And how this is shown here, we know that the Egyptians realize this in next week's Parsha, but there's something in the text itself on these three plagues, 7, 8, and 9, where a very interesting thing you pick up in the text. They're all described as something that has never been before. So the hail on verse so 14 and 15. 14, God says, I'm sending these plagues, they'll know there's none like me in the world. And then how I know it? I could now stretch forth my arm and smitten you and your people with the epidemic. Sorry.
No, I think it's at this time tomorrow I will rain down a very hard.
Yes, never in verse 18. Never before in Egypt, from the day it was founded until now, has there been anything like it. So it's emphasizing that this is not just a wild occurrence. Never before has it been like this, anything similar to this. The same is, and just if you skip the next week's Parsha, we get to the plague 8, the locusts, page 373. Verse 6, your houses and all your courtiers' houses and the house of all the Egyptians will be filled with locusts. Some of your fathers and your fathers' fathers have never seen from the day they appeared on earth until this day. So you get an emphasis that this has never seen before. And then the darkness, we know, it was a darkness that paralyzed them, something totally beyond. And so it was taking something which was, could be a natural occurrence. Hailstorms happen, right? Locust swarms happen. Darkness happens every day. Taking something they're familiar with but doing it in a way that was totally incomparable, that was totally unmatched and never seen before. That was meant to emphasize to the Egyptians and to the Jews that not only God is more powerful than anything else, the ultimate power of everything, and even kind of the natural things which we experience, God sort of is a force more powerful than those two. He can do them in a way that's never been seen before. And so this was the third sort of stage of developing the awareness, the consciousness of God, that God, who God is, much more personal, not just sort of a philosophical God, but a God that I am actually relating to as a power that's stronger than anything that I know. It's hitting home to me because I know things in the world, I know powers, I know things that are meaningful in my life, are powerful forces in the universe, and relating to those, God is more powerful than them. So it hits home in a much deeper way. And again, it went that degradation from the hail to locust to actually immobilizing the human beings, the Egyptians themselves. So intimating that the greatest force of existence is God. So just to sort of zoom out a little bit and to recap, the question we started with was, what was the point of these 10 plagues? Take the Jews out of Egypt, God could have done it instantly. Start with the last plague and seal the deal. God prolonged this because he wanted to develop a certain faith. It was sort of a pedagogical tool, an educational tool, and you can't do that instantaneously. If God would have done the 10 plagues one day each plague, it wouldn't have the same effect. The lingering effect of plague is what makes it sort of develop educationally in the minds and the hearts and souls, the consciousness of the people. Just seeing something happen once doesn't affect it the same way as experiencing it, living through it, giving it time to digest it. And then a few weeks later, the next plague happened. So each plague had its time to really make an impact and affect the conversations that people are having. So he gave it a new cycle, right? To really bring it home and then on to the next stage of this development. And that process of a year, that crucible the Jews lived through, that cemented their faith in God to the point that now they leave Egypt, they're ready to become the Jewish people. And so it was a performance God was setting up to shift the consciousness of the people.
At the heart of it, though, is like a very problematic exception. It seems like free will is a very important part of Jewish consciousness and Torah. Like there's not much of a point to anything if you don't really have the concept of a person being able to make a choice. And yet here's this story where central to the story is the manipulation of, Pharaoh doesn't really have free will. It's not really choice. It's not agency. He's a tool like anything else here. His agency is being toyed with by God. And I don't know if that happens elsewhere in the Torah. I've never thought about it, but maybe there are other situations, but it's still problematic because you're using the free will of a human being as a pedagogical device, essentially.
Good question. So the truth is,